Okay, thank you very much for that panel. We've had 4 great panels, 1 plenary so far, and then the 2nd plenary. So great pleasure to introduce Dr. Hilary Marston, who's the Chief Medical Officer at the FDA. So Hilary trained as an internist and then did a Master's in Public Health at Harvard. And she's done many other things in the past before going on to the Chief Medical Officer role. For example, she served as a senior advisor for global COVID-19 response on the White House COVID-19 response team. And at the moment, Hilary's role is really to serve as the primary clinical advisor to the Commissioner and overseeing the Office of Clinical Policy and Programs. And I met Hilary at a dinner in London a few months ago, and that's dangerous when you meet me because I invite you to come and do things and so on. So I'm very glad, Hilary, that you've agreed to come and give this talk. So thank you very much, Hilary.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation to come here and speak to everybody. I'm a little bit shorter than you, Munir, so I'm going to move those mics down, and if you have trouble hearing me, just let me know. So I'm going to speak to you today about improving health outcomes through clinical innovation. I'm going to speak about it from a regulatory point of view, but the main point that I want to get across, and you can tune out after this, is that the research that we're doing, particularly in the post-approval setting, is not fit for purpose. But we have every opportunity right now to fix that in a way that I think will fundamentally change, I hope, patient care. Optimistic? Yeah? All right, we'll see where I go from here. Okay, so the standard disclaimer, so these are my views, not those of the FDA, and if I mention a commercial product, it's not an endorsement. I personally love this slide because every slide in the slide deck is going to have the FDA logo on it, right? But they're just my ideas, right? I'm just spitballing here as a regulator. Yeah, sorry, lawyers at FDA. All right, so I'm going to speak about a couple of different topics. First, some problems that we have, particularly in the US, but also the UK, as I'll show. Increasing costs, increasing complexity in healthcare. Second, practice at the moment is primarily not evidence-based. And third, some opportunities to fix those issues. All right, so first problem. In the US, life expectancy is falling. And unfortunately, it's corrected a little bit in the most recent data, but it is still an issue even once you control for COVID, once you control for the opioid crisis. And the truth of the matter is, we don't really know why. And the problem that I have with this is that I don't hear everybody ringing the alarm bell on this, right? We're losing life expectancy. Why is that not something that everybody is talking about, that everybody is trying to get to the bottom of? And unfortunately, the UK also experienced the same. You guys are certainly doing better than us, everybody is. But it continues for men and women, though men seem to have even more of an issue. This measure of potential life years lost tries to get at the issue of preventable life years lost. So what can we actually control through our behaviors, through medications, et cetera? What can we do and that will result in more life years? The US is not doing well here. We're doing better than some of our neighbors to the south, but we're not doing terribly well. The UK is doing better than us, so bully for you. But honestly, the UK is not doing so well as compared to some of its peer nations, unfortunately. All right, now, healthcare expenditure, the story gets even worse for the US, and here's where the UK diverges. So not only do we have poor health outcomes, but we're paying a ton to get our poor health outcomes. We just look terrible compared to our peer nations. I have no defense for this whatsoever. Perhaps this has something to do with the incentives issue that we had discussed in the last session. In fact, I'm almost positive it does. But those are fundamentals to our, frankly, disorganized US healthcare system. The UK has far better value for the money. And the UK is not alone there. This slide is a little bit cheeky, and frankly, I borrowed it from the commissioner. But looking at countries with universal health care, look, they're all clustering so nicely with life expectancy and health expenditure data. The US is on its own. How's that for US exceptionalism? All right. Health research expenditure. So this is not for lack of spending, right? The National Institutes of Health budget has gone up year after year. In fact, the FDA envies their budget quite a bit. We are now giving $47 billion to the NIH per year. And despite all that, our health outcomes are getting worse. Part of the issue there is that the large clinical trials that are being funded both by industry and government are getting more complex. So if you compare the number of procedures performed, the number of planned visits, they just go up and up over the years, and trial cost goes up as well. So we're not getting the outcomes that we need from the trials, and we're spending quite a bit on it. How does this translate into care? So this is particularly alarming to me. So the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association did an analysis of their clinical guidelines, trying to understand how much of what they were recommending was actually based on high quality evidence. 8.5%, right? Oncology is no better. And the Europeans do a little bit better than us, 14.2%, but still like very poor numbers, right? If you look at the surgeons, it's far worse. But these oncology and cardiology are two of the best funded research areas. If anybody should be getting this right, it's them. All right, so what do we need to do about this? So fundamentally, I think that the healthcare research system is working pretty well for phases 1, 2, and some of 3. You could argue phase 3 is too expensive and some savings could be found there, but largely it's working to deliver the evidence that we certainly need and some of the evidence that clinicians need. The issue really comes in this post-approval space. So here is where the drugs from their clinical trial settings meet large patient populations, meet patient populations that are on any number of other drugs, particularly elderly patients, and we simply don't have the evidence to guide clinical care. One of the things that this results in, particularly in vulnerable populations, is that we have no information to really guide care. And there is a somewhat misguided, in my opinion again, impulse to avoid research in those vulnerable populations as opposed to doing research with the proper safeguards in place. And what that means is that instead of protecting through research, we're protecting from research and leaving clinicians even more in that bind where they don't have the evidence that they need to guide care, particularly a problem in children. Pregnant women who in the common rule are not a vulnerable population, but certainly additional safeguards are needed. Okay, so how does this result look in the actual development of drugs? Again, the system is working very well to weed out candidates before they go to those large, very expensive trials. The issue is not there. The issue is in later development and post-approval. So what are the opportunities here? What can we do to help improve the situation? So first, what does the FDA have to do with this, right? Certainly, a lot of the health outcomes that I was mentioning go well beyond the clinical setting, right? Social determinants of health are enormously important there. The preventive activities that would need to really take place in adolescence, set in adolescence, are well beyond the clinical impact, but certainly beyond what a regulator can hope to impact. But we do play a role in research, and we don't fund that much research. So I told you the NIH has a budget of $47 billion. I have some of our only grants programs under me in the Office of Clinical Policy and Programs. We have about 30 million. So, we don't do that much research, but clinical research rather. But we do have a significant role in public health. So it's straight in our mission statement where we say that the FDA, by helping the public get accurate science-based information that they need to use medical products and foods to maintain and improve their health. That is core to our mission and something that we try to support. Within this area, what we're trying to support is where the guardrails are for regulators in order to have regulatory quality trials, what we would want to see in terms of quality of the trials, but also in terms of flexibility. So where can we introduce flexibility? So I'm going to talk about a couple of different areas here. So pragmatic trials, decentralized trials, digital health technologies, real-world evidence, diversity in clinical trials, trials in public health emergencies, and patient voices. And the great thing is some of these concepts have been so well covered by my colleagues that I can skip over them quite quickly. All right. Pragmatic trials. So we have a little bit of an alphabet soup in the innovative clinical trials space, or rather, some people call it a Tower of Babel, where folks are referring to trials using similar language, but honestly, they're speaking past each other a lot of the time. So it's important to define what we're actually talking about here. So the best way to look at this, in my opinion, is to compare them to traditional RCTs. So whereas a traditional randomized controlled trial would have significant monitoring, assessments, tests, clinical follow-up visits, they can be a burden on clinical trial participants. They yield fantastic information that can be mined years into the future, but they really are very resource intensive. So pragmatic trials are really aiming to just get the minimal information that's necessary to answer a research question. And the important thing is that they're meant to be more reflective of actual clinical practice. So some advantages of these, they're meant to be more efficient. You're trying to go for breadth of trial, large enrollment numbers so that you can detect an effect size, even with a number of other differences in clinical care ongoing. So you have to have simpler eligibility criteria. You're not going to have as pristine a data set. You have to have flexibilities in the trial delivery. So clinicians are going to make their own choices, and that is by design in the trial. You are tailoring your trial context to the clinical care setting. So you still have to make sure that patient safety is up front and taken into account, but other elements of the trial can be tailored. And you're hoping to reduce the burden of trial participation. So this should just look to the patients like their everyday care. Pragmatic trials can result in evidence that's more representative of broad populations. So we had some questions earlier today on diversity of clinical trial enrollment. This is one of the ways that we're hoping to expand the clinical research tent. So this is a pragmatic trial that I love. I'm a little bit biased here because I was in residency with one of the investigators, but what they did here, for the clinicians in the room, this I hope will resonate. In intensive care units, in empiric therapy for sepsis, there were two camps, at least in US healthcare settings, and a UK clinician will need to tell me whether this carried over here. Empiric therapy folks who loved piperacillin tazobactam and those who loved cefepime. And the pip-tazo folks swore that cefepime caused far more neurologic events. And the cefepime folks swore that pip-tazo caused so much more acute kidney injury it wasn't worth it. And neither of them knew, actually, what the answer was. So what these folks did was they designed a pragmatic trial. Importantly, at the beginning, they got a waiver, a minimal risk waiver from the IRB. So again, patient safety has to be front and center. So what would happen in the trial, once they had that waiver, was any clinician who was ordering either of those meds, there would be a prompt in the electronic health record saying, would you be willing to randomize? Great. So what they were looking at, primary outcome, acute kidney injury or death, and secondary were whether you were alive, free from coma or delirium. The answer, treatment with pip-tazo did not result in higher rates of acute kidney injury. Cefepime did increase your risk of neurologic dysfunction. So I don't know whether that's going to change practice. I don't know whether the camps will suddenly all go over to pip/tazo, but it is interesting data that hopefully will at least make people, question. All right, decentralized trials. We recently published a guidance on decentralized trials, and as we had discussions around this, one of the things that we realized was that we were too binary in our thinking, right? Trials are not decentralized or not decentralized. They are trials that can have decentralized elements. And the truth of the matter is these are innovative, sure, but we've had decentralized elements in trials going back decades, right? So you could always incorporate something like getting your local lab draw, getting an x-ray done in one location. But what we wanted to do was have folks understand what sorts of elements could be decentralized, what the menu is, but also what the guardrails were on decentralization. So things that you might consider decentralizing, using digital health technologies, I'll get into that in a second, using lab tests locally, distributing the investigational product directly. So a lot of trials are now mailing product, home visits, and then conducting clinical follow-up using telemedicine, consenting using telemedicine. That was a tool that we really developed during the pandemic. It has proved very important for scale up of clinical trials. For example, the TPOXX trial that was done for MPOX. This was a trial where we did not have enough sites early on. So what we did was we allowed remote informed consent in order to expand the reach of the trial. So you can go to our website and see this guidance, but it goes through all of those elements, and what it clarifies is what the actual regulatory requirements are related to each of these things. So for example, if you are going to have a home visit done, is that person then an investigator, right? Do they have to do all of the GCP training? And the answer is, it depends on the protocol itself, but in all likelihood, if it is routine care, they won't have to. So we just want people to understand where we have, where we're going to be strict, and where the bounds of our regulations lie. All right, so Active 6. This was a decentralized double-blind platform randomized control trial, still actually going on. This was for outpatient mild to moderate COVID-19. And what they did was patients would call up when they had a positive diagnosis, they would get mailed their medication, and they would complete surveys online about how they felt. This has been run by PCORNet, so the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Network. So this is drawn largely from data sets across the United States. So they've looked at a range of drugs, metformin, fluticasone, fluvoxamine, ivermectin, montelukast. This was one of the studies that was able to give us the critical information that ivermectin did not work, even if taken early in COVID-19. Hasn't necessarily changed opinions on the matter, but it was an important tool for us to at least be approaching it in an evidence-based way. So the benefits of trials with decentralized elements: reducing costs, we hope, we'll see. Increasing diversity. So again, that idea of meeting patients where they are. So can we actually reach rural populations with our trials? Something we've never been able to do properly. Reach populations with less access. So as was mentioned before, there are these great clinical research centers. What about folks who are going to community hospitals and safety net hospitals? And then reduce exposure. This was specific to COVID-19, but honestly, you could extend it to any number of trials. Being in the healthcare system on a frequent basis is not risk-free, right? So we want to make sure that when we're doing that, it really is necessary. All right, digital health technologies. We spoke a little bit about this, the potential of wearables. So the great thing about wearables is that suddenly you can go well beyond measuring blood pressure in the clinic. You can actually understand how people are living with their disease in an evidence-based way. The issue with these is if they're going to be used for endpoints, we need to actually have some data that shows us that we can rely on them for that. So the problem there is that companies aren't necessarily willing to invest in that or take a risk that the digital biomarker will pan out. So what we're trying to do is find partners that will help us with this issue. We have partners like the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, PCORNet, which I mentioned earlier, that are willing to look at some of these outcomes, some of the things that are more ready for prime time. So for example, continuous blood glucose monitors, and then compare them to traditional outcomes. So how well are they actually predicting the outcomes that we want to understand better in our clinical trials? Hopefully, this will result in more efficient trials, but also in trials that really reflect the experience of the patient with disease on an everyday basis. We all know white coat hypertension exists, and yet we're relying on trials where people are coming in and having their blood pressure measured there. AI, I'm not going to touch on this, right? You got a fantastic lecture on AI just a little while ago. This discussion paper, which was mentioned in there, goes through our current thinking in this area. It's just a discussion paper, so it's not yet guidance. I think as our thinking in this area evolves, you should expect to see more from us on our thinking here. Real-world evidence. So again, the alphabet soup. I want to make sure that we're thinking of the same things when we use these terms. So real-world data and real-world evidence are often used interchangeably, and they shouldn't be. So real-world data is just data drawn from the real world, whether it's a digital health technology, an electronic health record. Real-world evidence uses that real-world data to drive causal inference. So this is actually used whether you're using an external control, whether you're randomizing with a pragmatic trial, or using an observational study. The key here is that you're trying to draw a conclusion about safety and effectiveness. So we put out our thinking before I even got to the FDA, so I can't claim any credit for this. I was over at the NIH working on pandemic preparedness, an area that was kind of a backwater at the time and unfortunately got way too busy. But at the beginning of our work in RWE, the FDA put out this framework, and it talked through what our thinking would be around real-world evidence and laid out a menu of future guidances. And if you look at our websites, they have just been executing against this plan, right? So they have put out guidance after guidance on these issues. But the key considerations that were laid out in that initial paper were first looking at the data itself. Is the data fit for use? So before you even consider whether the evidence provided is going to be high quality, you need to make sure that the data is good. All right. Second, whether the trial or study design can actually generate high quality real-world evidence. Third, whether the trial overall will meet FDA regulatory requirements. So that will often mean, can we get patient-level data? It might also mean are proper protections for human participants in place. At the same time, we were developing a research program for real-world data and real-world evidence because, honestly, we're just scratching the surface of what can be done here. Like AI, we're learning along with the research community. So we have invested in research in this area. For example, a notable project that came out about a year and a half ago in JAMA was RCT Duplicate. So this was an effort to try to see how well that RWE could recapitulate important clinical trials. Not only did it do that, but it also came up with a prediction tool so that you could understand how well that you would be able to emulate it. I think that tool has not yet been used significantly, and I'm hoping that it will be used in a prospective way. Diversity in clinical trials. So the FDA has looks at diversity through various lenses. We certainly try to make sure that we're looking at vulnerable populations and specific subpopulations, as well as racial and ethnic diversity. We have put out specific guidance on how to conduct trials in children, pregnant women, older adults. I think there's more to come there. And then specific action on diversity, specific planning on diversity action plans. So that initial thinking was summarized in a guidance that's already up on the web. As Robin mentioned, we're working on putting the finishing touches on an additional guidance in this area. I really appreciated a point that Robin made, which was the importance of planning early. So what we've seen in clinical trials far too often is this catch-up phenomenon. We saw it in Operation Warp Speed with some of the trials that we were working on. And honestly, we got to the end of them as funders, and the representativeness was not there. So we kept them open. The issue there is that these are event-driven trials, right? And the individuals most at risk had the least event time in the trial, which was both inefficient for the trial, but also honestly didn't give us the representation that we would have wanted. So the numbers probably look better than the trials actually were. All right, patient voices. So there was an excellent panel on this. I'm not going to go into this in much detail, but patient voices, we're trying to find ways to incorporate patient voices at every different stage along the development spectrum. This starts with just listening. Like a patient group can just request a listening session with the FDA, and our experts from the various review divisions will just listen to a moderated conversation about what it's like to have the disease. Obviously, the patient-focused drug development program is a key pillar, but we also have patients on advisory committees. The interesting thing about the patient-focused drug development, I think this is a crown jewel for the FDA. I'm not just saying that because Robin's here, but it's not necessarily intuitive that this would have been a role for a regulator, right? Like finding out what those outcomes should be a role for research institutions, should be a role for investigators, sponsors. But there was a gap, and the FDA filled that gap. So I think I would like to see more investment from research institutions in the area. Clinical trials during public health emergencies. So unfortunately, one of the worst things that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic was just lousy research. These were trials that were nowhere near powered to answer the questions at hand. Unfortunately, regulators have tools to help advise on clinical trial protocols, and certainly if there's a safety issue, we have some regulatory teeth. But otherwise, if folks want to ignore our advice about design, they can, right? And a lot of these didn't even come to us. So unfortunately, I think we need to take a real look at whose responsibility it is to make sure that you have quality in your protocol. It's a shared responsibility, is the truth, but we each play a role. One of the best examples of research that we saw in the pandemic was the recovery trial. I found the last panel particularly interesting because if you hear Sir Martin Landry talk about this trial, he will highlight the fact that actually the NHS is not this one beautiful data lake that you can draw from, right? He chose the outcome of mortality both because it's the hardest outcome that you can have, and a lot of other trials were criticized for not using that, but also because he could reliably get it out of the system. Other outcomes might not be available. So this is one of the things that investigators need to think about. I am hopeful that we'll have more structured data that will be able to be used by the research community. That being said, we can't structure everything, right? We already have clinicians getting carpal tunnel syndrome from clicking. And it's frankly annoying during visits as they go through those algorithms. So we're going to have to be thoughtful and try to make sure that the outcomes that we're looking at are meaningful at all stages, right? Meaningful to the patients, meaningful to the clinicians, meaningful to researchers. So it's definitely not impossible, but that thought has to be there. So in summary, post-market evidence generation, we have some areas for improvement. The FDA is doing its part, but we look forward to partnering with folks across this endeavor. We're putting out guidances, we're trying to expand clinical research, we're looking at ways to incorporate new tools and technology, but we have a long way to go. So just some acknowledgements. Glad to take your questions.
Hilary's agreed to take some questions. Any questions? We just need some microphones if that's okay. So, definitely.
Thanks very much for a great talk. I wonder if you could comment on your views of FDA's role in compelling commercial sponsors to generate head-to-head data in that post-marketing environment.
Yeah, it's such a good question, and our tools are limited in that area, right? I ask you to find me where in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act it says that we can force folks to use a given comparator. And it's not surprising, again, back to this incentive system, that folks are looking at the comparator that's going to be the easiest to beat. That being said, we do have a tool in the U.S. government, U.S. government, that's meant to help with this, and that's PCORI. When the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute was set up, one of the key things it was supposed to be working on was comparative effectiveness research. And they've done some of this, but a lot of what they're doing is actually comparing different models of delivering healthcare, and I think not enough on drugs. So I'm hoping that that's something that they'll look at in the future.
Thank you. Any more questions? Maybe I can ask a question. Thank you. So you covered what the FDA is doing from a public health perspective, but we are sort of seeing more and more complex therapies coming onto the market and treating precision medicine kind of approaches, highly individualized medicines. For example, the FDA had to license Millicin, I think a couple of years ago, and those kind of highly individualized medicines are going to come through more and more, to treat these rare diseases. So I just want to understand FDA's perspective on that, because you have this sort of large public health programs, but also those very highly individualized medicines coming through as well.
Yeah, we're in an exciting moment right now in clinical therapy, both because of these personalized approaches, but also particularly the advent of gene therapy. We have flexibility in our ability to understand safety and effectiveness through biomarkers, through clinical surrogates using the accelerated approval pathway. This is still somewhat difficult for some of these personalized medicines, for some of these medicines in particular that impact pathways, right? Because the actual biomarker that you might choose is not necessarily intuitive. For gene therapy, it's very intuitive, right? You're just measuring how much protein that you actually make. For those that impact pathways, it's less clear. So the work on biomarker development has to proceed along with the work on developing these personalized medicines. The other point here is that when you get an accelerated approval, you have to prove clinical benefit down the line. So it's a reasonable likelihood of clinical benefit for the surrogate, and then you have to demonstrate that it actually did what you said it was going to do. And most companies had been doing this, but there were some folks who were kind of yassing us on about that and never completing those research studies. So in FDORA, which was the 2022 Appropriations Act for the portion for the FDA, the FDA Omnibus Reform Act, we got teeth for this. So we are now able to require that there be a trial that's actually started when we approved the drug, whereas before it was just that we needed a plan.
Thank you. Trevor Jones. I have the honour and privilege of bringing together every year the top 15 global R&D directors in the HEVA group, and Rob Califf has been a part of that for years. One of the things he said to us last year was basically the first few slides you showed. Prevention has got to be a big byword there. Now, this industry can't close down McDonald's and all that stuff,
Yeah.
but one thing we are starting to discuss is whether some of the programs we have in diabetes, in anxiety, in addiction, whether some of the agents we're developing could actually be a very major component with all the other social changes. So I would urge you in the FDA to be the leaders of that initiative, because it's bringing us together with the, with the social care would be great.
Yeah, so first, we're not off the hook for the foods part, right? We have food, we're the Food and Drug Administration. So I think that the role of ultra-processed foods is one that we need to understand better. The role of sodium is well described, so we do play a role there. We have tobacco under us as well. So there are elements of prevention that are within the FDA's purview. A couple of points on prevention. First, I think we look at prevention too often through the adult lens, right? And we need to be looking at it starting in adolescence and possibly even earlier. That's both because of the behaviors that set in, but also because the disease processes clearly begin during adolescence. So that's a change in the way that we look at clinical research, but also in the way that we look at data. So the data conversations that I've seen focus a lot on the adult setting and not enough on the pediatric setting, and particularly that transition. So making sure that we actually get that information through. On the broader issue of research questions that are related to public health, so it will not surprise you that Rob Califf is a big proponent of this. FDA plays a role here, but we can't do it alone. So, and you know this. So we are at the table with some of those partners, including the NIH, and trying to draw folks in around a set of priorities. So this was done about 10 years ago by NASEM, looking at the key clinical questions. It hasn't been refreshed. And in the meantime, we have just a ton of innovation, right? So I would love to see a refresh of that, but not only that, I would love to see that be a to-do list for our research entities.
Britain and Europe may be able to take some of those models.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
You mentioned earlier on the graphs that one of the challenges of complex comorbid conditions, complex multiple therapies. Do you have a perspective on a best way forward on that?
On a best way forward in terms of what? In terms of
how to tease those problems out and come up with evidence-based medicines in those complex conditions, which tend not to be addressed in those early trials and are a function of real-world data and evidence?
Yeah, it's a great question. Part of this is about the data that you're actually collecting as you conduct these trials. So that's probably the easiest information if you're running a pragmatic trial to get out of the electronic health record, particularly in the US because we're set up for billing, right? So we know what we're prescribing, we know what we're billing for. When you have the data, though, you're not going to be powered in all likelihood to look at all combinations there. So you'll be able to interrogate it, and using some of our more advanced statistical methods, you might be able to get some pretty good ideas of what's going on there. But I think it's incumbent on us to then look a little bit further, right? So to go into those hypothesis-generating areas and actually test those hypotheses.
This is a completely unfair question in your session, but I bring it up because it's something that hasn't been mentioned by any of the panelists, and it is the biggest explosion in public health in the UK, and that's mental health.
Yeah.
I have 2 children, they've got 2 partners, they've all got mental health problems, 3 of them using the NHS. Whenever I talk to anybody with kids, people of my age, they've all got mental health problems. Now, I just wonder, have you any comment about that? Because it's just not been addressed at all since 9:30 this morning.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's an area where we have a lot of work to do on the outcomes that we're looking at. Robin's group is a key part of this, and grateful for the work that they can do in this space. But the way that we're measuring outcomes in these trials doesn't necessarily reflect the way that these diseases manifest, and doesn't reflect the way that they're treated. So in a lot of cases, psychiatrists will be trying to tweak medication to deal with single aspects of depression, single aspects of anxiety, and titrating accordingly. They might have patients on multiple medications, but the studies that we're looking at will look at the entirety of depression scores, the entirety of anxiety scores. The other issue here is that a lot of those individual components overlap in different conditions. And it's quite possible that from a patient perspective, what they would want is improvement in those components, rather than improvements in an established score for one condition. So I think we're ripe for another look at that. And I know that our colleagues over at the NIH are thinking about this as well. It's underinvested in. And in terms of pragmatic trials, until recently, these health records were really quite segregated away. I think I still have concerns about cybersecurity. I'm totally with you on that, and particularly for stigmatizing conditions like this. But there is more opportunity to do research there than before.
Okay, last question.
Oh, sorry, thank you. Nick Thomas here, Royal College of GPs, so please don't boo me in the room. Sorry, yeah, just your pragmatism, amazing talk. Thank you so much, first of all. But secondly, really, phase 3 trials in primary care that we get a lot of, really strict eligibility criteria, as you said, very hard to meet. Is the FDA sort of working on that, trying to push life sciences to more down the pragmatism route? I know we struggle with that in the UK as well. So just your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, so we don't have an ability to push companies one way or the other, but what we can do is help companies understand and have some reassurance if they're using some of these approaches that they might see as riskier, that we let them know the way that regulators might think about them. And then we also open up additional pathways to come and speak to us. So for example, if you're using a real-world evidence approach broadly, pragmatic within there, you can consult our experts in real-world evidence so you actually understand what some of those pitfalls will be. The other hope here is that they actually will be more cost-efficient, right? And then companies will be incentivized to use these approaches. They'll enroll faster, they'll get answers, they'll get to market faster. So the incentives are there, but we actually need more practice in how to do these trials.
Great, thank you very much, Hilary. So it's up to me now to close today's conference. First of all, I'm sure you'd agree that we've had a fantastic session today with 4 great panels and 2 excellent plenary lectures. They were educational, incisive, but realistic as well, highlighting the challenges, but also the opportunities. But there are many areas which we couldn't cover today, like mental health, and that gives us opportunities to be able to cover that next year, for example. So I think the panelists, chairs, etc., did a fantastic job, and speakers, so let's just give them a round of applause, please. So when you're trying to organize something like this, you start a long time ago. So we started well over 6 months ago. And as today approaches, your anxiety level gets higher and higher. First of all, are the speakers going to turn up? Are the speakers going to be all right, etc.? And then it gets, so my anxiety level is now much better, down to baseline, so you should be glad to hear that. So I do want to thank all the people who've been involved in delivering today's conference. The first really is that Bruno and team at Galien, who worked extremely hard in terms of delivering this. So thank you very much, Bruno. And Arno, thank you very much for the AV management today as well. Thank you. And in terms of publicizing this event, some of the company that worked was with Finn Partners and so on, and they're also in the room as well, so let's thank them as well. And I worked very closely with Archie, with Cora, and with Leo at Morehouse, and I got emails from them frequently to make sure I was doing things properly and so on, so thank you very much for keeping me in check. And finally, thanks to you as well for sticking it out till 4:30, really, and thank you very much for your engagement today and the questions and so on. So I hope you have enjoyed it. For those of you who are going to be coming to this evening's event, I look forward to seeing you there. If you can't make it to this evening's event, then I wish you safe travel home. So thank you very much, everybody.